It was a quiet Saturday morning when everything changed. The soft rustling of the leaves and the hum of the birds were suddenly shattered by the screech of tires on gravel. My heart skipped a beat, and before I could process what was happening, a shiny BMW rolled up my long, dusty driveway and parked haphazardly near my old truck. The woman who stepped out was nothing short of a storm. Her heels clicked on the ground with a harsh rhythm. Her sharp, blonde hair framed a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. She was out of place on my 10-acre property, dressed in an immaculate suit that looked more suited for a boardroom than a ranch. I wiped my hands on my dirt-stained jeans and stood, wary of this sudden intrusion. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to mask my unease. She didn't respond, not even a glance, as she marched straight toward me, her expression hardening. "Give me the keys to the gate now," she barked, her voice shrill. "I'm taking possession of this property, effective today." I blinked, stunned, as a wave of confusion washed over me. This woman was insane. "I'm sorry," I managed, trying to process what she was saying. "This is my property," I said slowly, trying to figure out how she had ended up here, let alone why she thought she had any claim to my home. The woman's face reddened, her anger rising. "Don't play games with me," she snapped, stepping closer until she was nearly in my space. "I just closed on this property last week. Now hand over those keys or I'll call the police." I felt my pulse quicken as the realization set in. This wasn't some bizarre misunderstanding. This woman genuinely believed she owned my property. "I think you're mistaken," I said, voice steady despite the storm raging in my mind. "I inherited this land from my uncle over a year ago. I think you've been scammed." The words barely left my mouth before she screamed, "I paid good money for this place. It's mine now, and if you don't give me those keys, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Panic and anger started bubbling in my chest, but I kept calm, trying to reason with her. "Ma'am, whoever sold you this property didn't own it," I said, my voice firm. "Let me call the police, and we can sort this out." But Karen, as I would soon learn her name wasn't having any of it. She yanked out her phone, dialing 911 with a sense of triumph, her smug look enough to make my blood boil. "I'm calling the police." "You're the scammer, not me," she hissed. I shook my head, unable to believe this was happening. This woman had been scammed, or worse, was trying to scam me. As she ran it into the phone, I pulled out my own phone, dialing 911. "Hi, I'm at my property, and there's a woman here who claims to have just bought it," I explained calmly to the dispatcher. "I inherited it last year, and now she's demanding the keys to my gate. I think she's been scammed." It wasn't long before the distant sound of sirens reached my ears, a sign that the situation was about to escalate. But little did I know, this was just the beginning of a series of events that would forever change my relationship with my inherited land. I turned back to face Karen, who was now pacing, her phone pressed to her ear as she shouted accusations. The police were on their way, and I could feel my nerves tightening as I realized the fight for my property had just begun. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this. The wailing sirens grew louder, and within minutes, 2 police cruisers rolled up my driveway, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. Karen's smug expression sharpened as she crossed her arms, her stance shifting into one of absolute confidence, as if she had already won whatever battle she had started. The officers, one a grizzled man in his 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, and the other a younger woman with sharp eyes, stepped out of their vehicles and approached us. I took a breath, trying to remain composed as Karen launched herself at them with exaggerated distress. "Thank God you're here," she wailed, clutching her chest dramatically. "This man is trespassing on my property and refusing to leave. I have all the documents to prove I own this land, and he's trying to steal it from me." The officers exchanged a glance before turning to me. I could see the flicker of skepticism in the older officer's face. Karen's overly theatrical display wasn't doing her any favors. Still, protocol was protocol. The female officer turned to me, her voice level and calm. "Sir, do you have any proof of ownership for this property?" I nodded, already prepared for this. "Yeah, I've got all the paperwork inside," I said, gesturing toward the house. "I inherited this land from my uncle over a year ago. I don't know what she was told, but I never sold this property." Karen scoffed loudly. "Lies. I have a legally binding contract. He's trying to scam me." The female officer sighed and turned to Karen. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation with you?" Karen hesitated, her face twitching slightly before she straightened. "It's at my house, but I can get it," she said, a little less sure of herself. The older officer glanced at me. "Let's take a look at what you've got." Without another word, I turned and walked toward the house, feeling the heavy presence of both officers behind me. Inside, I went straight to the cabinet where I kept all my legal documents, pulling out the file with my uncle's will, property deed, and every official record proving my ownership. When I turned, I saw Karen hovering in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly, her mouth pressed into a thin line. I handed the paperwork to the officers, and they carefully examined each page. The female officer frowned as she flipped through the documents. "This all looks legitimate," she murmured, then turned to her partner. "It's a clean inheritance case. Title, registration, everything checks out." The older officer nodded and sighed, before turning back to Karen. "Ma'am, based on this paperwork, he is the legal owner of this property." Karen's face went from red to nearly purple. "No, that's impossible. I paid for this house. I have a contract," she shouted, her voice now shaking with either rage or desperation. "Who did you buy it from?" the older officer asked, his expression unreadable. "Angela White," she snapped. My stomach dropped. I knew that name. Angela White was my realtor, but I hadn't been in contact with her in months. The officers exchanged another glance, and the female officer spoke again, her voice firm but even. "Ma'am, you may have been the victim of fraud. If you made a payment to someone who wasn't authorized to sell this land, you need to file a report." Karen clenched her fists. "No, I didn't get scammed. He's lying. This is my house. Arrest him." Her voice cracked as she pointed a shaking finger at me. The officers didn't move. Instead, the older one took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, as if he had dealt with people like Karen before. "Ma'am, I suggest you calm down," he said evenly. "Right now, what we have here is a civil dispute. If you have a contract, you need to bring it to the police station so we can verify it. But as it stands, Mr. Reynolds is the rightful owner, and you are trespassing." Karen's lips trembled, and for a moment, she just stood there, chest heaving. Then, her face twisted into something ugly, something mean. "This isn't over," she spat, before turning on her heel and stomping away, her heels crunching against the gravel. She reached her car, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut so hard I thought she might shatter the window. A second later, her BMW roared to life, tires spitting dirt as she reversed down the driveway at an alarming speed. The younger officer let out a low whistle. "Well, that was dramatic," she muttered. I rubbed a hand down my face, exhaustion already sinking in. What do I do now? The older officer handed me back my paperwork. "If she comes back or tries anything, call us immediately," he said. "We'll also follow up on this supposed contract of hers. But my guess? Someone took her for a ride, and she's in denial." I exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, that makes sense." The officers exchanged a few more words with me before heading back to their cruisers, leaving behind a trail of dust and the faint hum of my thoughts racing in my head. My peace had been shattered by a woman who was either a scam victim or a scammer herself, and something told me this wasn't over. I watched the horizon long after the police left, waiting for the storm I knew was coming. The next morning, I barely had time to sip my coffee before my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Angela White, my realtor, her voice laced with concern the moment I answered. She had received a call from the police asking about a supposed sale of my property, and she was just as confused as I was. As I explained the situation, I could hear the sharp inhale on the other end of the line. "That woman must have been scammed," Angela said, her voice clipped with irritation. "But the problem is, I never listed your property. There is no legal way anyone should have a contract for your land." A knot tightened in my stomach. That meant one of two things. Either Karen had been tricked by someone pretending to own my land, or she was in on the scam herself and thought she could bully me into giving it up. Before I could voice that thought, another car came tearing up my driveway, a different one this time, an older sedan, nothing like the flashy BMW from yesterday. I stepped onto the porch as a woman climbed out, clutching a thick folder to her chest. She was middle-aged, dressed in business casual, her expression wary but determined. "Mr. Reynolds?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously around. I nodded, phone still in hand. "Can I help you?" She exhaled, shifting the folder in her arms. "I'm Melissa Smith. I work with a title verification service. I need to speak with you about a fraudulent listing on your property." My pulse spiked. "You're saying my property was listed for sale?" I asked, stepping down from the porch. "Illegally?" Melissa nodded, glancing at the ground before looking back up at me. "It was posted on a real estate site under a private seller's account about 3 weeks ago. The listing claimed the owner was in financial trouble and needed a quick sale. I was hired to verify the title before the transaction could go through, but I flagged it as suspicious. I reached out to the supposed seller and never got a response. That was a red flag, but it looks like someone named Karen Smith was desperate enough to believe it was real. My grip on the phone tightened. "So she wired money to a scammer?" Melissa nodded grimly. "It appears so. From what I found, the scammer used an alias and a fake notarized deed. It wouldn't have held up legally, but Karen must not have done a deep enough check before paying." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "And now she thinks she owns my house?" Melissa hesitated before speaking again. "I've dealt with cases like this before. Some victims refuse to accept the truth. They'd rather double down on the lie than admit they've been conned." A cold realization settled over me. That explained Karen's behavior. She wasn't just trying to convince the police or me. She was trying to convince herself. If she admitted she had been fooled, she'd have to accept that she lost a significant amount of money. And judging by her desperation, she wasn't ready to do that. "What happens now?" I asked, exhaling slowly. "Can she take legal action against me?" Melissa shook her head. "Not successfully. If she tries, she'll be forced to provide the fraudulent contract as evidence, which will only expose the scam further. But she might not be thinking rationally." Before I could respond, the unmistakable sound of screeching tires filled the air. I turned just in time to see Karen's BMW flying up the driveway once more, her movements frantic as she climbed out. The fury in her eyes was almost unhinged. "You think you can lie to the police and steal from me?" she shrieked, storming toward me. "I want my house." I raised my hands, trying to remain calm despite the way my blood pounded in my ears. "Kara, you were scammed. The listing was fake. You need to go to the police and report it." "No." She cut me off, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You're the scammer. You and your little real estate buddy set me up." I exchanged a glance with Melissa, who looked just as alarmed as I felt. Karen's breathing was heavy, her fists clenched. She wasn't just angry. She was unraveling. "I already called the police," I said carefully, watching the way her chest heaved. "They're on their way. If you have any real proof, this is your chance to show them." Her nostrils flared, her jaw tightening as she took a step back. Then, without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her car. For a second, I thought she was leaving, but then she did something that made my stomach drop. She popped open her trunk. I instinctively stepped in front of Melissa as Karen pulled something out, a crowbar. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Karen!" "Put that down," I warned, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. "This isn't going to end well for you." But she wasn't listening. Her face twisted with unfiltered rage as she gripped the crowbar tightly, her knuckles white. The sound of sirens filled the air again, this time much closer, and I saw the flashing lights just beyond the trees. Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was too late. The police cars came to a screeching halt, and officers spilled out, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon. Now!" The command rang through the air, but Karen stood frozen, as if her mind couldn't process what was happening. Then her expression crumbled, and she let the crowbar fall to the ground with a heavy clang before bursting into tears. The officers moved in quickly, cuffing her as she sobbed incoherent protests. I stood there, my breath uneven, watching as the reality of the situation finally caught up with her. She had lost, and in trying to reclaim what she thought was hers, she had only managed to dig herself even deeper into a hole she would never climb out of. The weight of everything that had happened over the last 24 hours settled on me as I watched the officers lead Karen toward their cruiser. She was still sobbing, her face blotchy and streaked with mascara, her entire body shaking as she shouted incomprehensible protests. I could hear the desperation in her voice, the way she clung to whatever last shred of hope she had that this was all some kind of mistake, that she wasn't the one in the wrong. But reality was finally crashing down around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. One of the officers, the older one from before, walked up to me and exhaled slowly, his expression tired. "Well," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck, "this took a turn, didn't it?" I nodded, glancing toward Melissa, who was still standing a few feet away, looking shaken but composed. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice steady despite the lingering adrenaline coursing through me. The officer sighed. "Well, considering she just brandished a weapon on private property and ignored multiple warnings from law enforcement, she's looking at a few charges: trespassing, brandishing a weapon with intent, resisting arrest. It's not going to be a light slap on the wrist." His words made sense, but even so, I felt no satisfaction watching Karen sob in the back seat of the police cruiser. Despite everything, she was still a victim, just not in the way she thought. She had lost money, her dignity, and now her freedom, all because she was either too prideful or too blind to accept that she had been played. Still, that didn't make what she did right. She had threatened me, tried to take something that wasn't hers, and if the police hadn't arrived when they did, who knew what would have happened? Will they be able to catch the scammer who took her money? I asked after a beat of silence. The officer shrugged. Hard to say. Real estate scams like this are tricky. They'll investigate, but these fraudsters cover their tracks well. Chances are the person behind this is already gone. That was a sobering thought. Someone out there had gotten away with Karen's money, and she had taken all of her misplaced anger and frustration out on me instead of the real criminal. And now, she was the one paying the price. I turned to Melissa, who was clutching her folder tightly, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming here and telling me what you found," I said sincerely. "If you hadn't looked into it, I wouldn't have even known my property was listed." She gave me a small, weary smile. "It's part of the job," she said simply. "But I have to say, I've never seen a case escalate quite like this." I huffed out a humorless laugh. "Neither have I." Another officer approached, handing me a business card. "If she tries anything else, if she shows up here again or contacts you in any way, give us a call," he said firmly. Given the way she reacted today, I wouldn't put it past her to try again once she's out. That thought made my stomach twist, but I nodded, pocketing the card. "I'll keep that in mind." The officers loaded Karen into the back of the cruiser, her cries growing more frantic as reality set in. "You don't understand," she wailed. "That's my house. He stole it from me. You have to believe me." Her voice cracked, breaking into incoherent sobs as the door slammed shut. The older officer shook his head as he climbed into the driver's seat, and within moments, the police cars were reversing down the driveway, kicking up another cloud of dust as they disappeared down the road. The silence they left behind felt almost suffocating. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where Karen had been standing just minutes before. The past day had felt like something out of a nightmare, an entitled woman showing up at my house, demanding my keys, calling the police on me, and then finally unraveling completely when faced with the truth. And yet, as the dust settled and the sun climbed higher in the sky, I felt an odd sense of peace creeping back into my chest. It was over. My land, my home, was mine, just as it always had been. No amount of entitled delusions or fraudulent schemes could change that. I turned back to Melissa, who was still lingering, watching me carefully. "Do you think she'll actually let this go?" I asked, exhaling. Melissa hesitated, then shook her head. "Some people never do," she admitted, "but the law is on your side. As long as you stay vigilant and document everything, you'll be fine." I nodded, processing that, then glanced toward my garden, where my tools were still scattered from yesterday's interrupted work. "Well," I muttered, stretching my arms, "I guess I should get back to work." Melissa let out a small chuckle, shaking her head. "You're handling this a lot better than most people would," she remarked. I shrugged, feeling the tension slowly leaving my shoulders. "I've learned that getting worked up over things I can't control doesn't help much," I said. "Besides, at the end of the day, I still have my home. That's all that matters." She smiled at that, offering me one last nod before heading toward her car. "Take care, Mr. Reynolds. And if anything else comes up, don't hesitate to reach out." "Will do," I replied, watching as she drove off, leaving me alone once again. I stood there for another long moment, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, the distant chirping of birds filling the air. Slowly, I turned back to my garden, picking up the tools I had dropped the day before. As I knelt in the dirt, the familiar scent of earth surrounding me, I let out a slow, relieved breath. My home was safe. My peace was mine again. And no one, no entitled stranger, no scam artist, no fraud, was ever going to take that away from me.